I know, choosing an architecture for your app is difficult. For SwiftUI, there are debates everywhere about which patterns is the best between MV and MVVM. There are many developers out there telling you different opinions. You might find it very confusing, especially if you're a beginner. So, I make this video to help you design the best pattern for you and your team. Before we dive in, let's take a short moment to look at the elements in iOS apps in the big picture. There are views, navigation, and root as a base for every app. In most apps, there are networking to fetch data from servers. There might be persistent storage for some apps that work offline like database, files, or user defaults. Last but not least, there might be some distinctive features like contacts, Bluetooth, location, etc. MV and MVVM are architectural design patterns that focus solely on the presentation layer. These patterns help us organize complex states and actions within the presentation layer, and they briefly tell us how the presentation layer connects with other parts of the app. However, as you can see, MV and MVVM don't cover everything in our apps. They don't tell us how to write good navigation or good networking. If our apps get more complex, we are still able to mess them up even though we know MV and MVVM patterns. That's why concepts like clean code, solid principles, domain-driven design, clean architecture, or TCA are important for advanced app development, but that's beyond our scope for this video. Anyway, MV and MVVM patterns are still important. Let's see them in action. This is our starting project. It fetches weather conditions of various cities around the world using Apple's Weather Kit and displays in the list. However, the implementation can be improved. The fetching logic is mixed with the view down below, making our view longer than we need. So I will show you how we can use MV and MVVM patterns to help our situation. Let's start with MV pattern. This stands for Model-View. It's a pattern recommended by Apple. You will see almost every example from Apple use this pattern because it's straightforward for new developers to adopt. First, I've moved fetching logic out of this view and creating my own wrapper on the weather kit. Then, I'll inject this back to weather list view using environment. And we're done. It's very simple, right? We encapsulated service call into classes and still leave logics in the view. Only few changes made our code a lot cleaner. You can see this pattern is a very good start for beginners or prototyping or simple projects. But let's take one more step. Personally, I prefer to split a view into two views called the container view and the rendering view to create separation of concern and improve testability. Let me show you how. Whether this view does many things, even though it has only 38 lines of code. First, it receives services through environment. Second, it performs tasks to fetch weather conditions from server. And finally, it renders the result. I will move the rendering part from line 17 to line 28 to the rendering view. And yes, I will create a new view, and I will leave others here and call it the container view. Alright, this way we have a clear separation between view and logic. The view is in the rendering view, and logics and dependencies are left in the container view. Since the final outcome has two views, some developers call this pattern VV. It stands for View Pattern. Take a look at the preview once again to check if everything works. It's error. Let's take a look. Okay, I see. I forgot to add the environment here. Alright, now it works. Let's move on to the next example. Let's see how we apply another pattern called MVVM, which stands for Model-View-ViewModel Pattern, with the same weather list view. First, I will duplicate the weather list view.swift and rename it to weather list MVVM view. And in this example, I will reuse the rendering view, so I will remove it from here. And I will rename our view to weather list MVVM view, and I have to change the preview too. In this pattern, we create a ViewModel class for each view. The ViewModel is responsible for managing business logic. Let's see in action. I will create a class called WeatherListViewModel. Then I'll move all states and logics from here to the ViewModel. Now we have ViewModel. Our view is even more concise than before. Business logics are moved to the ViewModel, and states and actions related solely to the presentation like animation and gesture will remain in the view. Let's update the preview as well. Everything works fine. That's how we apply MVVM pattern. When using MVVM, it's a good practice to separate the view state from the view. So I've moved the enum out of the rendering view. like this. I'm doing this because the view model must know nothing about the view itself. When we move the enum outside, we don't have to specify the view namespace anymore. Some people omit the container rendering pattern when they use MVVM to simplify the code, and that's totally fine. It's up to you to take an extra step or not. If you feel creating view model for each view is too much, you can just create view model for some views you need. Now you've seen both patterns. Let's compare. I'll open both patterns side by side. The reason I used container rendering patterns earlier for MVVM because it helps us compare better between these two. On the left side, we use MV pattern, which is already concise and straightforward. And on the right side, we use MVVM pattern, which the view part is even more concise, but overall code is longer. Well, they're pretty much the same, but there are some differences between them. First, let's talk about frameworks. MV pattern has a very quick access to new frameworks made for SwiftUI like SwiftData for database or App Storage for user default. We can use them right in the container view, but we cannot do that on MVVM. You might argue that we can do the same for MVVM's container view, but that breaks the pattern and makes our code look hacky and unnecessarily complex. In MV, we can also inject frameworks or dependencies using environment easily, but in MVVM, we have to manually inject our dependencies. Well, it's actually not bad because we trade simplicity with compile time safety. That means we can't accidentally forget to inject any dependencies, which can happen with environment, and that benefits when we work with a team. In terms of reusability, in MV pattern, we can reuse logic across views because it's tightly coupled with the view. But the view models in MVVM don't know about view or platform, so we can reuse the logic with other views. In terms of testability, it's much easier to perform unit testing in MVVM. If your app is complex, or if you and your team care a lot about unit testing, I'd say MVVM is better. But it's not like you can perform unit testing in MV, but it's not straightforward as in MVVM, and you can only do that to a certain extent. So, it's also an option not to perform unit testing at all for percentage layer in MV. If your views are simple enough, like in this example, instead, you perform unit testing on other parts, such as the networking, like the weather service wrapper. I did talk a lot about the two popular architectural patterns, MV and MVVM. Now it's our time to wrap up and choose between these two patterns. Yes, the answer is definitely the classic "it depends," but I know it won't make your life easier, so I'll give you some tips to help you decide. If you want quick results, for example, if you're building a prototype app or a complete but simple app, I recommend to go with MV pattern, especially if you are a beginner. Because in MV pattern, you can directly access many frameworks built for SwiftUI, like SwiftData, which you can't with MVVM. And this pattern is a bit more concise than MVVM, so it might help you achieve quicker results. If you are building app that lasts for years with complex features, and you don't get benefit from frameworks like SwiftData, and if you don't mind taking extra steps, I recommend MVVM for you. Well, in reality, the best pattern when working alone is the pattern you're comfortable with, the pattern you know how to deal with, the pattern you know how to read and update your code after a while. If you're working in a team, it's a bit more complicated situation because not all of us have the power to decide which pattern to use. In fact, the pattern might have already been decided even before you join the team. But just in case some of you do have the power to choose the pattern, choose what works best for your team, not just yourself. In some cases, you can decide for them, but make sure your team implement the pattern correctly. Remember one thing, that choosing between MV and MVVM is not a life-deciding moment. It's not black and white. You saw earlier how easy to convert from MV to MVVM or vice versa. You can even mix both patterns in one app if needed. So don't be afraid to pick one. Every pattern is good in its own way. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and see you in the next one.